In September 1942, the Soviet 13th Guards Rifle Division crossed the Volga River into the city of Stalingrad, 10,000 men strong. 2 months later, 320 of them walked out alive, which comes to a 97% casualty rate. Not for an entire war, not for a full campaign, but for a single unit defending a single city across a single autumn. And those 320 survivors belonged to the winning side. This is the Battle of Stalingrad, the deadliest single battle in the history of the human species. Roughly 2 million people ended up killed, wounded, or captured across 200 days of fighting in a strip of burning rubble 9 miles long and 2 meters wide. A freshly arrived Soviet reinforcement crossing the Volga could expect to survive not weeks, not days, but hours. German soldiers died in greater numbers trying to capture one apartment building than their army lost taking the entire city of Paris. And tonight, you're spending the night there. The reason you're here in the first place comes down to one word, and that word is oil. By the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler faced a crisis he could not bluff his way past. Operation Barbarossa, his invasion of the Soviet Union, had stalled outside Moscow the previous winter, and the blitzkrieg that conquered France in 38 days ground to a halt in Russian mud and snow. Germany needed fuel desperately, and the Caucasus oil fields at Emop, Grozny, and Baku produced roughly 80% of the Soviet Union's petroleum. Hitler put it plainly when he told his generals that if he did not get the oil of Mop and Grozny, then he would have to end the war. And standing between the German army and those oil fields sat a long industrial city stretched along the western bank of the Volga River. Europe's longest river served as the main artery carrying Caucasian oil northward to Soviet factories. And capturing this city would sever that lifeline completely. The city also happened to bear the name of Joseph Stalin himself. Two dictators now found themselves locked in a staring contest over a city with that name stamped across it, each carrying an ego roughly the size of continental Europe. Hitler wanted Stalingrad as a personal trophy, while Stalin treated the defense of his namesake as an existential matter. You, the ordinary soldier, got to die in the middle of their standoff. On July 28, 1942, Stalin issued Order Number 227, and its nickname tells you everything you need to know. Not one step back. Penal battalions formed overnight for soldiers who retreated without authorization. Blocking detachments took up positions behind your own lines. Armed with one specific job, which was to shoot anyone running the wrong direction, commanders who pulled their men back without orders earned the official label of betrayers of the Motherland. Now, those blocking detachments have become somewhat mythologized over the decades. Soviet-era historians denied they ever existed, while Cold War Western accounts claimed they machine-gunned entire retreating battalions. What the archives revealed after 1991 turned out to be more complicated than either version. Between August and mid-October 1942, blocking detachments on the Stalingrad and Don fronts detained over 51,000 men, and roughly 95% of them went right back to their units. 980 of them, though, did not go back anywhere because they were executed. That is a real number. Nearly 1,000 men shot by their own side in 2 months. But it is not the tens of thousands that popular history tends to imply. Most of these blocking units functioned as military police, rounding up stragglers and redirecting them. Though if you happen to fall among the 980, that distinction meant nothing to you. Picture yourself as a Soviet soldier arriving in Stalingrad. With all of that in mind, ahead of you stands the entire German 6th Army, the Luftwaffe, and approximately 500 tanks. What's behind you runs the Volga River, a mile wide with no bridge spanning it. Behind that, wait men carrying orders to shoot you if you try to cross back. Advancing will kill you. Retreating will kill you. And surrendering is not a category that exists in your army's vocabulary. Your only option is to stand in the rubble and fight until you destroy everyone in front of you, or they destroy you first. That is the situation awaiting you in Stalingrad. Now consider what the city actually looked like when you stepped off the boat. Because by the time ground fighting began in earnest, Stalingrad barely qualified as a city anymore. 30 miles of urban sprawl hugged the western bank of the Volga, only a few miles wide at any point. 3 massive industrial complexes dominated the northern end. The Dzerzhinsky tractor factory was the Barakardy Ordnance Works and the Red October Steel Works. American engineers had helped build the tractor factory in the 1930s, and before the battle it manufactured T-34 tanks. What makes this detail extraordinary is that during the battle, the factory kept manufacturing T-34 tanks, rolling vehicles directly off the assembly line unpainted, lacking gun sights crewed by factory workers who aimed through the gun barrel bore at point-blank range. That is not a metaphor for desperation. That is an actual production schedule. Mamayev commanded the center of the city, an ancient Tartar burial mound rising about 300 feet above the surrounding terrain. Whoever controlled it could observe every street and direct artillery fire across the entire urban area, which meant both sides threw everything they had at it. And control of the hill changed hands 8 times before the fighting ended. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed one of the most devastating aerial bombardments of the entire war, flying roughly 1,600 sorties and dropping 1,000 tons of bombs in a single day. Over 90% of the city's housing simply ceased to exist. Bombs struck the oil storage tanks lining the Volga bank, and a tremendous fireball climbed 1,500 feet into the sky, while the column of smoke remained visible from 200 kilometers away. Petroleum spread across the water and ignited, turning the Volga itself into a burning river. 25,000 civilians died in that single day of bombing. Before the war, approximately 450,000 people had lived in Stalingrad, but wartime refugees swelled the population to somewhere between $600,000 music and 900,000. Soviet authorities refused to evacuate most of them because they believed soldiers would fight harder defending an inhabited city, and they were right about that, though nobody bothered to ask the civilians how they felt about serving as motivation. A 10-year-old girl named Tamara Kulbasina remembered thinking the war was far away until planes appeared overhead in masses, and the city detonated around her. She described the Volga as a ribbon of fire. Over the next 168 days, she survived in open trenches while her best friend died beside her. What the bombing left behind resembled a landscape that soldiers on both sides compared to hell, only to correct themselves within days. And one account attributed to General Chuikov described troops approaching the city, claiming they were entering hell, and then, after a day or two, revising their estimate upward. No, this isn't hell. This is 10 times worse than hell. And this is where it gets strange, because the ruins actually became the Soviets' greatest weapon. General Vasily Chuikov took command of the 62nd Army on September the 12th, declaring, "We will defend the city or die in the attempt," and then developed a tactic he called hugging the enemy. Soviet forces pressed their lines within 50 to 100 meters of German positions, close enough that the Luftwaffe and German artillery could not bomb them without killing their own troops. Germany's air superiority and heavy firepower, the 2 advantages that had conquered most of Europe, were neutralized by the simple strategy of standing so close to the enemy that hitting you meant hitting themselves. The fighting devolved into something closer to medieval siege warfare than anything the 20th century had seen before. Small storm groups of 6 to 8 men armed with grenades and submachine guns crawled through sewers and blown-out basements, fighting room to room, floor to floor, sometimes through holes smashed between walls. German soldiers coined a word for it, Rating, meaning the War of the Rats. And the term captured exactly what it felt like. One German veteran of the factory district put it bluntly. Entrenching tools and his engineer's axe proved better weapons for hand-to-hand combat than rifles. And on any given day, the Soviets occupied the first floor, while his men held the ground floor or saw the reverse in what amounted to a series of daily close-quarters engagements with no resolution. Your daily existence in this environment looked something like this. A bombed-out cellar served as your home. Lice covered every inch of your body, and bathing belonged to a life you barely remembered. Food arrived by boat across the Volga at night, if it arrived at all, and sleep came in shifts measured in minutes rather than hours. Every time you lifted your head above cover during daylight, a sniper could end your participation in the war permanently. Snipers stalked every sight line in the city, and the most effective among them was Vasily Zaitsev, a hunter from the Ural Mountains who arrived in September 1942 and accumulated 225 confirmed kills between October 10th and December the 17th. Before anyone issued him optics, Zaitsev used a standard Mosin Narant rifle without a scope and still killed 32 Germans in his first weeks. His innovation, called the Sixes tactic, paired 3 teams of 2 snipers to cover overlapping zones, which made movement across open ground almost suicidal for the enemy. More than 30 students trained under him, and those students received collective credit for over 6,000 kills during the remainder of the war. A famous story circulated about Zaitsev engaging in a multi-day duel with a German super sniper named Major Koenig, supposedly the head of Berlin's sniper school. And the 2001 film Enemy at the Gates dramatized the whole affair. Historian Anthony Bivor and extensive archival research, however, have concluded it was almost certainly Soviet propaganda. A no Mario Kernish appears in any Wehrmacht records. Germany operated no sniper school in Berlin, and the most successful German sniper of the entire war held the rank of Lance Corporal. None of that diminishes the fact that Zaitsev's verified, documented kill count needed no embellishment to terrify anyone. Snipers represented only one layer of the danger, and the people fighting alongside you provided another kind of education in what humans are capable of under pressure. On October the 2nd, 1942, a private named Mikhail Panikaka found himself defending a position near the Red October factory. As a German tank advanced on his trench, he grabbed a Molotov cocktail and stood to throw it. And that's when a bullet struck the bottle in his hand, igniting the fuel and engulfing him completely in flames. A reasonable person would have collapsed, but Panikaka seized his second Molotov, climbed out of the trench fully ablaze, sprinted toward the German tank, and smashed the bottle onto its engine grill, destroying the vehicle and himself in the same moment. Chuikov recorded that everyone witnessed a burning man leap from the trench. The posthumous Hero of the Soviet Union Award reached Panikaka's name 48 years later, which means the paperwork moved considerably slower than a man on fire. Soviet psychological warfare added another dimension to the misery. Loudspeakers broadcast a ticking metronome toward German lines, interrupted every 7 seconds by a voice announcing that every 7 seconds, a German soldier dies in Russia, followed by the words, "Music, Stalingrad, mass grave." Soldiers called the accompanying music the Tango of Death, and it played all night, every night, drifting across the frozen ruins. The real killing, though, came from artillery and bombs, and from those there was no cover and no escape. October 14th marked what Chuikov himself called the worst day of the battle, when the Germans launched their final major offensive push against the tractor factory. 1,400 Luftwaffe sorties filled the sky by early afternoon, while a 100 tanks rolled through the factory grounds, and an estimated 3,000 Germans died at the factory complex during those hours alone. Desperation reached a point where one Soviet regimental commander radioed headquarters requesting that his own command post be bombarded because German submachine gunners surrounded him, and he figured dying by friendly fire at least meant taking the enemy with him. Every reinforcement, every round of ammunition, was every bandage reaching the Soviet defenders had to cross the Volga under constant bombardment during this period. Crossings happened after dark, with crews hammering wooden plugs into shot holes, while their boats kept moving and the burning city cast a glow visible from 30 millimeters away that silhouetted every vessel on the water. November brought ice flows that turned the river into a death trap of a different kind. Too clogged for boats, but too thin to walk on, and soldiers drowned while supplies disappeared beneath the surface. They kept crossing anyway, because the alternative meant losing the city entirely. As horrific as all of that sounds, we haven't even reached what happened after the Germans found themselves trapped. And trust me, you want to stay for that, because if the battle for Stalingrad was hell for the attackers, what came next defied any comparison. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, sending 2 massive armored pincers crashing through the weak Romanian armies protecting the German flanks. 4 days later, those pincers met at the town of Kalak on the Don River, and the entire German 6th Army. Somewhere between 250,000 and 330,000 men found itself completely encircled. Hitler refused to authorize a breakout. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, promised he could supply the trapped army by air, and the numbers he ignored tell the story of what happened next. The army required a minimum of 550 tons of supplies per day, while the Luftwaffe's theoretical maximum capacity topped out around 118 tons, and what they actually averaged came to 94 to 105. Their best single day produced 230 tons. The airlift turned into a catastrophe wrapped in absurdity. 488 transport aircraft went down. 1,000 aircrew perished. And the supplies that actually landed inside the pocket sometimes defied comprehension. One flight delivered 4 tons of marjoram and pepper, prompting a furious supply officer to ask whether his men were supposed to hurl the pepper in the Russian troops' faces. Another flight carried millions of contraceptives into a surrounded army in December in Russia, which is not dark comedy, but an actual historical fact confirmed by multiple sources. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm on December the 12th as a relief attempt that fought to within 30 miles of the pocket. Trapped soldiers could see the gun flashes winking on the horizon and told each other, "Danstein compted. Manstein is coming." They could hear the artillery of their rescuers close enough to reach with one hard push. And that's when Hitler refused to let Paulus break out to meet the relief force. On December 23rd, the attempt collapsed. Those gun flashes on the horizon went dark, and Manstein, as it turned out, was not coming after all. What followed amounted to slow-motion annihilation. London radio aired a comparison that stung. Poland fell in 28 days, but in Stalingrad, the Germans spent 28 days capturing several houses, and France collapsed in 38 days. Dadri descendur Ranon, but 38 days in Stalingrad bought the Germans a single street. But on Christmas Day 1942, 1,280 German soldiers died in the pocket, while temperatures sank to -25 C. General Paulus distributed a holiday ration of 6 Oz of bread, 3 Oz of meat paste, 1 Oz of butter, and 1 Oz of coffee, without mentioning that the following week would bring cuts to 2 Oz of bread and a bowl of fat-free soup. Clothing froze to men's bodies because standard German boots featured metal studs that conducted heat away from the feet, and lubricants in weapons and vehicles congealed until nothing functioned. A German soldier named Helmut Meenborg recorded, "Clothing freezes on our bodies. We haven't eaten or slept in 3 days. Horses went first, then dogs, then whatever else moved." One soldier wrote home about shooting a magpie, cooking it, and appreciating the vodka that washed it down. Rats followed the magpies into the cooking pot. Reports of cannibalism surfaced in the final weeks, though documentation remains understandably thin. Men too weak to stand froze to death at their sentry posts, and badly wounded soldiers were carried outside and placed in the snow, which counted as a mercy compared to dying slowly from infection in an unheated basement. German letters home traced a trajectory of escalating despair. Walter Opperman told his brother that 140 men had reached Stalingrad, and after 2 weeks of battle, only 16 remained. Another soldier declared it pure hell and called Stalingrad a grave for the German army. By January, a soldier named Joseph Schwartz read the Soviet surrender ultimatum and wrote that a burning malice toward his generals boiled up inside him because they had evidently decided to bury everyone in this hellish place once and for all. Meanwhile, mice chewed through German tank wiring and disabled vehicles, which sounds almost amusing until you realize tank crews froze to death because rodents ate their engine cables. On January 10, 1943, the Soviets opened Operation Ring with 7,000 artillery pieces firing simultaneously, the largest single bombardment of the war at that point, concentrating 338 guns per kilometer of front in some sectors. What remained of the pocket collapsed inward. January 30th brought a promotion for Friedrich Paulus, but elevated to Field Marshal in what amounted to an instruction rather than an honor. No German field marshal had ever surrendered, and Hitler intended Paulus to understand that he should kill himself rather than be captured alive. Pa surrendered the following morning, reportedly declaring, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this Bohemian corporal." He became the first German field marshal ever taken alive. General Streicher surrendered the northern pocket on February 2nd, and his final radio message conspicuously dropped the customary Heil Hitler in favor of Long Live Germany, a substitution that nobody mistook for an accident. Officially, the battle ended on February 2nd, except that over 11,000 German soldiers refused to accept it and kept fighting from cellars and sewers until early March, and a full month after the formal capitulation. Some fought out of ideological commitment, and others fought because they knew exactly what awaited them in captivity, and their fears turned out to be well-founded. Of the roughly 91,000 men who surrendered, fewer than 6,000 ever reached Germany again. 27,000 perished within weeks of capture, and the rest died in Soviet prison camps over the following years. Repatriation of the last survivors did not occur until 1955, a full decade after the war ended, which means the death rate among those prisoners of war ran between 93 and 94%. Almost 90% of the captured German generals, however, lived through captivity because survival in the camps correlated neatly music with the number of stars on your uniform. Now, the Stalingrad also produced stories of endurance so stubborn they border on the unreasonable. On September 27th, Sergeant Yakov Pavlov led 4 men in a charge to seize a 4-story apartment building sitting 300 meters from the Vular. Reinforcements grew the garrison to about 25 soldiers, and they fortified it with barbed wire, minefields, machine guns covering every window, and an anti-tank rifle positioned on the roof. German forces attacked daily with infantry and armor, and the garrison held for 58 days while losing exactly 3 defenders. On Paulus' operational maps, this single apartment building carried the designation of a fortress. Roughly 30 civilians sheltered in the basement throughout the entire siege, and a baby named Zinaida Andrea entered the world there during one of the daily attacks. Chuikov later offered an observation that manages to be both statistically plausible and spiritually devastating at the same time. The Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they lost taking Paris. Consider the grain elevator as well, a massive reinforced concrete structure where about 50 Soviet soldiers repelled at least 10 major German assaults across nearly a week. Tanks, flamethrowers, and 88mm guns all failed to dislodge them with the 88s, leaving only a series of small round holes in the concrete, according to one observer. Burning grain inside the structure choked the defenders. Water supplies gave out. Ammunition dwindled toward nothing, and their radio went dead. When they finally broke out under cover of darkness, the Germans entered and discovered only 40 Soviet dead, far fewer than they had assumed. A German soldier named Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote in his diary that the elevator was occupied not by men, but by devils that no flames or bullets could destroy. 2 days later, he added that if all the buildings of Stalingrad were defended like this, none of his fellow soldiers would get back to Germany. He came close to being right about that. The women of Stalingrad wrote their own chapter in the fighting. The 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment, staffed mostly by teenage girls fresh from high school, stood as the only unit between the 16th Panzer Division and the city on August 23rd. Those girls cranked their anti-aircraft guns down to horizontal and opened fire on tanks, and Soviet records credit them with destroying or damaging 83 tanks and 15 armored vehicles, dispersing 3 infantry battalions and bringing down 14 aircraft across 2 days of continuous combat. German soldiers only discovered they had been fighting women after overrunning the positions. One German pilot, a veteran of campaigns in North Africa, admitted he would rather fly 10 times over the skies of Tobruk than pass once through the flak sent up by Russian female gunners. Now, bring all of this back to yourself. You arrived in Stalingrad sometime in the autumn of 1942, crossing the Vular at night in a wooden boat while the city burned on the horizon ahead of you. 30% of the men who crossed with you will not survive tomorrow. You carry a rifle that may or may not have ammunition, and you are standing in the remains of what used to be an apartment block, aware that somewhere on the floor above you, or possibly below you, German soldiers crouch close enough for you to hear them breathing. Retreating means drowning in the Volga, or meeting the blocking detachments on the far bank. Advancing means walking into rubble that is mined, sniped, and pre-registered by artillery. Staying still accomplishes nothing because a mortar round does not care about your plans. You are hungry, freezing, and covered in lice. And the man crouching next to you has survived 3 days in this position, which makes him a veteran by local standards. Every 7 seconds, the Soviet loudspeakers reminded the Germans, a German soldier dies in Russia. Nobody mentioned how frequently Soviet soldiers died as well, but the arithmetic worked out to roughly 2,400 Soviet deaths per day, every day, for 200 consecutive days. The combined toll of soldiers and civilians on all sides approaches 2 million, all concentrated in one city across one battle, the deadliest in recorded human history. When the guns finally stopped, the city that once held nearly 1 million people contained somewhere between 10 and 60,000 survivors. 90% of buildings lay in ruin, and all 126 industrial enterprises had ceased to exist. The soil of Mamayev of Kurgan, that hill that dominated the city and changed hands 8 times, absorbed so much shrapnel and metal that it reportedly lost measurable height, and 35,000 soldiers remain buried beneath it. Today, the city bears the name Volgograd, changed in 1961 during de-Stalinization. Atop Mamayev of Kurgan stands. The Motherland calls a statue reaching 85 meters into the sky and still ranking as the tallest in Europe. 200 steps lead music to the summit. one for each day the battle lasted. Visitors walking the grounds today still find fragments of metal and bones surfacing through the soil. Because 80 years later, the earth has not finished giving back its dead. Stalingrad broke the Wehrmacht's spine and turned the tide of the Second World War. A victory forged in suffering so extreme that statistics cannot carry the weight of it. 2 million casualties registers as a number, not as an experience. The experience was burning grain in your lungs and frozen fingers on a trigger, and the sound of a man on the floor above you reloading. You would not have lasted one night. But then again, many of the men who were actually there did not last one night either. The only difference between you and them is that they never had the option of clicking.